are self-explanatory. The extension packs are interesting. They're just an extension that has other extensions as dependencies. And then I believe that this is an actual language pack, but don't quote me on that. But for now, we're just going to do a JavaScript extension. Going to do hello world. The hello world can be the identifier. We don't add a description. I'm not going to add JavaScript type checking. And then I will not initialize a Git repository. You can use either npm or yarn. Just for now, I'm going to use npm. And bam, that is an entire hello world extension. Oh. So thanks for coming to my talk. That's the end. See you guys next time. So I kind of gave it away earlier, and my transitions are not quite as smooth as I would like, but that is not the end of the talk, but that is the end of the coding demo. I will briefly talk about some of the different sections of the give me 1 second to get this back set up. There we go. So I lied. The reason that I don't want to do a coding demo here is because I don't think that a whole lot of people will actually be interested in developing VS Code extensions. And also, they are pretty difficult to boil down. The VS Code API is actually pretty ridiculous as far as like what is there. So that was too much for me to try and condense into a talk here. So instead, I'm just going to briefly brush over or briefly cover some of the key parts of the API that I think are either the most interesting or the most useful. So starting with authentication, the way that this works is not entirely clear to me, but I do know that it allows you to hook into existing GitHub or Microsoft sessions and other extensions. And the primary purpose of this authentication API is to allow you to interface with other running extensions. So they can provide an interface for actually hooking into a private session if you're logged into a service. The commands API is pretty simple. It's pretty much only used for registering the commands that show up in the command palette, but that is the only way to get commands to show up in there. So when you first start writing extensions, that's the primary command or the primary API that you'll be interacting with. The languages API allows you to tie specific functionality to a given programming language. So you don't want your JavaScript linter running when you're writing Python and vice versa. And so the languages API is a way of preventing extensions that you want to run automatically from running outside of their language scope. The Windows API is one of the funnest APIs to work with initially. It's in some ways a subset of the workspace API, but is its own thing. And basically all that is the current open window of VS Code. So when you want to manipulate the cursor or do things like sort lines, add indentation, all of that stuff is done through the Windows API. The SEM thought that I understood before this talk, but as I did more research for it, I am not confident enough to actually speak on it. My understanding is it is a way for VS Code to interface with version control, but I don't actually know if that's true, so I'm just going to move on, but I didn't want to remove it because then it would mess up the styling on the page. So, Workspace API. This is ridiculously large. Like, it takes several minutes to just manually scroll through the full Workspace API, and I feel like it should be broken up, and maybe Microsoft just hasn't done that yet. I honestly don't know. But that includes all of the information about VS Code. So which commands are, or sorry, which extensions are running, the information about the styling on the given page, all of the, I believe all of the Windows API information can be also accessed through the Workspace API. And it just includes a ridiculous amount of stuff. I'm not going to go into it just because there is far too much to actually go in past that surface level. Let's see here. I briefly wanted to give like a minute or two for anybody who has any questions about what I've gone over so far. If you want any further information about specific parts of the API.
Hi, Nate. This is Adam's headphone.
Hi.
I just had a background question. Do you have experience writing extensions in other editors?
I do not.
Cool. I was interested in this talk because I have been using Emacs for like 7 or so years. Mm-hmm. So obviously extensibility is like on my radar or whatever, maybe sure. More than like a JetBrains kind of person. So I'm excited to see what this is about, and maybe we can talk later about similarities and differences. So
sure. I will say I don't have much familiarity with Emacs, and most of my VS Code extension experience has actually been rewriting other people's extensions, just optimizing them, which you'll see why in just a second.
That's really cool.
Does anybody else have a question before I move on? Cool. So the best. These are the extensions that I am going to recommend to you, that they are the must-haves. So what are the must-haves? Your official language extension, whether that's ESLang or Python, or I can't remember what the other ones are. I think most of them are just the programming language's name, but the extensions for most languages provide your linting, and in my opinion, you just cannot write code without linting. I mean, it's possible, but man, it's rough. Waka time is a must-have for me, and all that does is keep track of how long you've actually spent on a given project. So it generates weekly reports and tells you which programming languages you've worked in and how long you worked in those languages, and just kind of gives you a breakdown top to bottom. For themes, it's totally your preference, but you know, dark themes are a must. I say that, but my slides aren't actually a dark theme. For most coding, snippets are a huge help, and I think that you should have snippets for whatever you're working in, whether that's JavaScript or React or Vue. IntelliSense is huge for programming. There's IntelliSense for all sorts of stuff, more than you might think. And then the final must-have is GitLens for viewing pretty much just Git blaming. It can do way more than that, but man, is that a useful tool. So you might be thinking, I know all of these extensions, or I already know all of this. So prepare yourself for the next slide. These are all of the VS Code extensions I have installed that are related to my development in Node and JavaScript. So this is the very true, totally accurate, completely comprehensive list of best extensions for JavaScript development in alphabetical order, excluding the honorable mentions. So I have a quick list here. I'm only going to highlight the ones that I think are like really must-have, worth mentionings. So having a good theme, I've got a couple listed here, an Old Hope, Atom One Dark theme. Those are both really good. There are tons of tools for finding a theme, and like I said, it's totally up to preference, so I'm not going to tell you which one is best. That's pretty easy to Google, like top 100 lists, and there's also tools for finding that stuff online. Autocomplete tag is another really common, popular one. It includes, it's actually an extension pack, which includes auto rename and I think autocomplete tag, or it's auto rename and something else, but it just helps with writing React and HTML in general. And then any sort of beautify or formatter is going to be super important. Better comments is one that I don't see people use quite as often. All it does is highlights your comments depending on which characters you actually use in them. So for instance, a to-do comment is going to get highlighted. Bracket pair colorizer is another really common one. Some people don't like it because of the color, but especially for new people, like for Kinsey students, I personally think it's a must. And actually, you want bracket pair colorizer too, not the original, just as a small side note there. Color picker is really useful for writing CSS. It just adds a color wheel and allows you to generate your colors using that instead of like going outside of VS Code to find those colors. Let's see here, CSS peek. This allows you to hover over a class in an HTML document and see which CSS attributes are being applied to that particular class. Then we have document this, which is just a docstring generator. Import cost is an interesting one. That tells you, it gives you a quick visual indication as well as the total size of an imported package. Not as important as it might be in other languages, but still definitely a useful thing to know. Path IntelliSense is great for quick code completion. Polacode, I know I'm jumping here quite a bit, but Polacode allows you to quickly take a snapshot of a section of code, which is useful for posting to Reddit or sharing with people if you just want a quick section. It also keeps your font as well as theme, so I really like that. Setting sync is a super useful extension for me, and if you have multiple computers in which you code on, it's probably super useful for you. What it allows you to do is use a GIST token, I believe it is, but it allows you to sync your VS Code settings across multiple computers. So I have in total over 20 computers. And if you include all of the computers that I actually manage and program on, that's over 30. Only 5 of those I regularly am on, but quickly being able to sync any changed extensions or settings across computers is an amazing feature. This is the only instance that I have listed here, but using to-do highlight with to-do tree, or better comments with to-do tree, is actually kind of incredible. What to-do highlight does is just highlights any to-dos that you have written inside of your code. And then to-do tree actually creates a separate item in your left-hand side icon bar. I don't know what it's called. And that allows you to see every time to do is, excuse me. Sorry about that. It allows you to see every time a to-do is written inside of a file in a tree. So you can actually very quickly go directly to where your to-do message is in any given file. So those two actually play together really nicely. And there are a couple other extensions that I found actually play together and have emergent behavior that individually they don't have alone. So that's an interesting thing to think about. VS Code icons, having an icon pack, it's basically like themes, but for your icons. Walk a time I've already mentioned. So those are the big ones out of this list that I think are useful for me. Those are the big ones that if you told me to strip this list down, those are the ones that I would choose to keep. But I do actually have all of these installed right now and regularly use all of the ones that are dotted. Honorable mentions are things that I don't use as often, but are still part of my programming, just not as much for JavaScript. Something that I will mention out of the honorable mentions is Kanban, which literally just adds a Kanban board inside of VS Code, but it's per project. And for me, not having to leave VS Code to look at a Kanban board is pretty useful. So does anybody have any questions or comments about this list of VS Code extensions? Okay. The worst, Sato Kazuma. If you know, you know. The worst thing about bad extensions is the code. A lot of people who are beginners will write a VS Code extension for a particular problem and won't necessarily have good coding practices. And there are quite a few really bad extensions as far as performance goes. And I think that that's the only bad thing about most VS Code extensions that are bad. But with that said, what actually makes an extension bad? It's two things. It's poorly written, and it's not actually useful for the problem that it's trying to solve, or it doesn't solve your particular problem. There are quite a few extensions that have been uploaded to the market that will say one particular thing, but will actually do another thing to solve an individual's particular problems. Um, some instances of that are there was a file creation, like an automated test folder creator that was for a very particular project, and it was just labeled as a generic project test maker, and it totally ruined the file structure of one of my projects because it reconverted it into this weird thing, and I didn't realize that that was the case until I went through and went to the actual GitHub page where it was hosted and read through. It wasn't listed on the actual marketplace page. So my recommendation for removing extensions is a four-step process. Is it actively harmful to your development process? So is it causing unintended side effects? Is it distracting you? Is it actively harmful to your coding? And then is it poorly optimized? I say poorly written, but I should have said poorly optimized. There are quite a few VS Code extensions that do simple things, like kind of one-trick ponies, that are actually really slow. The worst offender that I've seen was a extension for aligning characters. So it would like take all of the equal signs in a document and shift them to the furthest point. And it used nested for loops with 100+ line if else statement for determining which character was selected. And for a small document, it took about 2 seconds. And for a large document, it took well over half a minute to actually execute. So that's an extreme example, but being conscious of how long a particular extension actually takes to run, you can save yourself some headache by being aware of that and getting rid of slow extensions. I have quite a few extensions, if you couldn't tell, and some of them are genuinely distracting. Those are not great extensions to have, and you generally want to get rid of your distractions when you're coding. And then finally, and this might be more applicable to me, but I have quite a few extensions that I'm either not using or aren't really doing anything for me. And those can add load times. But if you're not using it, get rid of it. But then the truth of it is, I have this quote here: "The truth can be changed simply by the way you accept it. That's how fragile the truth for a human is." Bonus points if you can name which show that's from. But the truth is, do what works for you. Obviously, I have a ridiculous amount of extensions installed, and it's not reasonable for you to install that many extensions. I don't think that it is. What I've done is not a reasonable thing to do. It was more of an experiment to see how it would run and to test new extensions. I wouldn't have found Pola Code or Wakatime without doing this. So it was more of like a test to see how far I could push it. At one point I had 200 extensions. But do what works for you. Don't take anything that I've said as prescriptive. This is my personal truth. So overextending in an attempt to increase efficiency ultimately always decreases efficiency. So with that said, I have found that installing more extensions than the minimum has been helpful, but then refining that down into the extensions that I actually used has been really important. So there are some really silly extensions. Like I have an auto incrementer, which just allows me to select like n number of lines and then generate numbers 0 to n as text, or go from A to Z as is stuff that I've actually implemented into my workflow that, while not significant time savers, I do think over time have saved me time. So I do think that it's worth experimenting and installing things that you might not otherwise think are necessary. So for me, the biggest folly is having so many extensions installed actually does significantly impact performance. This is a small section of the load times when I first start up VS Code. Not all extensions actually launch at startup. Like I said earlier when talking about the documentation, you can set extensions up only to launch with a particular language or under certain circumstances. Unfortunately, not all of the extension developers have appropriately set that up. And so this was when I loaded up a JavaScript document. So you can see Django actually loads, the Django extension loads itself when I launch any coding document. So it takes 2 to 3 seconds to launch VS Code. So again, installing a ridiculous amount of extensions probably not a smart idea. But with that said, it's not just about being as productive and efficient and having the fastest loading times as possible. I really think Terry David, or is it Terry Davis? Sorry. Terry Davis had it right when he says, you know, programming should be fun. You should have fun programming. I'm having more fun programming than you ever will. He's probably telling the truth in that, but just because we should focus on productivity doesn't mean that we should sacrifice our fun. So I think the most important thing when playing with extensions is to have fun. We should also focus on things like productivity, decreasing mental load, simplifying your process. But the experimenting and having fun and trying new things, I do think is a really important part of that. And also I have skills development written here. In breaking VS Code with so many extensions, I have learned more about how the extensions work, as well as how VS Code actually works, than I otherwise would have without playing with them. So really, I do want to encourage you to install a VS Code extension. Just find one VS Code extension that you have seen but don't think that it applies to you, and just install it and see if you can integrate it into your workflow and what you learn in doing so. But that is the end of my talk. I want to thank Indy.js for hosting this meetup. I want to thank Kinsey Academy. I want to thank DMG for inviting me, as well as Stephen Williams and Tony for hosting this. So thank you.
Cool, thanks. I'm gonna clap so that there's clapping noises. Does anybody have any questions?
Nate, you were showing a slide there that had the time for load. Was that an extension to show you how much, or is that built in? Can you just put your screen back up and show us live where that load time is?
Yeah, for sure. Can I actually get host back?
Sure can. Hold on one second.
Thanks for coming out, Patterson.
What was that command? Show.
Oh, Nate, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry.
Show running extension.
Yeah, so show running extensions will show the running extensions, and it tells you the startup time. So startup activation is when I first launched VS Code, and then import cost, here you can see activation. That was activated by an event after VS Code launched. So I believe all of these are just launching as soon as VS Code launches, and then the rest of these are being triggered by events. And there's several events that can launch an extension. Something to note here, if I actually open up Hello World, the folder that this is in, you can run the extension. Oops, I see it went to my second screen. You can run the extension in the debugger to test it. So if we go here, I have the Hello World extension command. In the parent VS Code, Hello World doesn't actually exist. In order to install VS Code extensions, they have to be placed inside of the VS Code extension folder, which by default is located in your home directory under .vscode under extensions. So you can see. So if you just moved your Hello World into here, it'll actually load into your main VS Code.
All right on.
And then for testing load times, there is in your in your launch.json, there's an argument. I believe it's disable extensions, and that will launch your debugger without the other extensions that you have installed, which is useful because you can get if multiple extensions are triggering on the same event, they'll sometimes negotiate which one actually runs. So it's not a huge issue for most people, but when you have 155 extensions installed, there's quite a bit of conflict that can occur.
Thanks so much. Yeah, just looking at that list, I found a couple that were running like a solid 1.5 seconds, and I'm like, oh, goodbye. Yep. I did not know about that. Thanks so much.
Something else to note, different extensions will only trigger when their command is called. And so like that list is only applicable for kind of long running extensions. So if you have command only extensions, you actually have to use the debugger, and I haven't found a way past actually going into the source code and editing it. So another thing to note, all of the VS Code extensions are actually just JavaScript files inside that folder. Some of them are minified and will have licenses saying it's against the terms of service to reverse engineer this extension, even though it's just a plain text file. So that's interesting.
Don't do it, man. Don't do it.
Right? I would never, ever, ever.
We never unminify things, do we?
Other questions? Well, I realized that since we were talking about text editor related things, we probably should have added our primary text editor into the intros. I don't know that we need to go through and do that now and start a flame war, but I'm a Sublime Text user currently as my primary.
I mean, Emacs was mentioned, so that kind of just declares the war to begin with. So I gotta
Bring it
raise my
on.
hand for the Vim, you know.
Yeah, I was gonna say I only use Vim. My operating system is text mode only.
That's right. But I will say that I gave a talk on VS Code a bit back during a lightning talk, and that the Vim plugin for VS Code was what finally got me to open up an IDE and use an IDE. So I had used Vim plugins for various other IDEs, and they never made me happy. So.
Cool. I will, let's say thanks again to Nathan, or Nate, sorry, Nathaniel. I think that's sort of all we have for the night in terms of talks or anything like that. I will mention one more time for those that came a little bit later. Next month, we are doing lightning talks. So if you're interested in giving a shorter 3 to 5 minute talk on any topic related to JavaScript or software engineering or tooling or whatever, lightning talk's a great way to get started giving talks or force yourself to learn something. And then with that, I think we're sort of done and into the Hangout session.
Right on. Thanks so much, Nathan. I'm going to stop the recording now.